My new husband let his teenage daughter humiliate me at dinner, then screamed that I had no say in his house. So I quietly bought his entire kingdom while he slept. Chloe smiled at me from across the table and said I looked like the help. Grant, my husband of 6 months, laughed into his wine glass. He didn't even look up. I set my fork down slowly. I'd cooked that meal for 4 hours. Roasted lamb with the good rosemary, potatoes crisped exactly the way Grant said his mother used to make them, candles lit even though it was a Tuesday, his mother's china laid out with the care of someone still trying to be welcomed into a family. Chloe pushed her plate away like it was garbage. I can't eat this, she announced, loud enough for the whole table to hear. You'd think for someone living here free, you'd at least learn how to cook. She flipped her hair. 20 years old, dripping in a diamond tennis bracelet her father had bought to cover for missing her birthday in April. My family sat frozen around that long table. My mother, Valerie, stared into her water glass like it might answer for her. My sister, Maya, wouldn't lift her eyes off her napkin. Nobody said a single word while a child tore into me like I was staff hired for the evening. I finally spoke, calm, quiet. Chloe, there's a difference between money and manners. If you don't like the food, you're free to leave the table. That was it. That was all I said. Grant stood up so fast his chair screeched against the hardwood. He slammed his hand down on the table hard enough to tip a wine glass, red bleeding into the antique lace runner his mother had left him. Don't you dare lecture my daughter, he roared. This is my house, my money, my rules. You're a guest here, nothing more. Chloe smirked into her water glass, victorious, chin tilted like a queen watching a peasant get put in her place. My mother mouthed sorry to him, sorry to my husband, for the crime of raising a daughter who had asked a 20-year-old to use a napkin instead of her sleeve. Nobody at that table defended me, not one person. I stood up, smoothed my dress, walked out without another word. They thought I was upstairs crying. They had no idea what I was actually doing, because everyone at that table believed I was a modest financial advisor, pulling maybe $70,000 a year, driving a 6-year-old Honda, splitting grocery bills out of some kind of quiet, agreeable poverty. Grant married me thinking he was rescuing a woman from nothing. What none of them knew, what I had never once volunteered, was that I run a private equity fund managing close to $400 million in assets. I built it in silence, over 11 years, on purpose. I wanted a man who loved me and not my bank account. Grant showed me exactly who he was the moment he thought I had nothing to offer him but a warm body and a home-cooked dinner. Upstairs, I locked my office door and pulled the prenup he'd forced me to sign 4 days before our wedding, sitting in his lawyer's office in Charlotte while he tapped his foot and told me it was just a formality, baby. Don't overthink it. He'd made me waive everything. Spousal support, gone. Shared assets, gone. Any claim on the house on Larkspur Lane, gone. He thought that document protected his empire from me. He never once considered that it might do the opposite. 3 months earlier, my firm had quietly bought his defaulted mortgage off his bank for 11 cents on the dollar through a shell entity called Ashcombe Holdings that he had never once heard of and never would have thought to look for. Every rent payment he believed he was sending to some faceless private lender in Delaware was landing straight in my account. He was paying me $2,200 a month to live in his own house and calling it his kingdom. That night, I barely slept. I sat at my desk confirming every signature, every clause, every recorded date, cross-referencing the servicing file against the county assessor's records until 3 in the morning. By sunrise, I had a folder ready and a call already placed to my lead attorney, a sharp, unbothered woman named Renata Cole, who had helped me build half the fund's holding structure, and who answered on the first ring even though it wasn't yet 7. At exactly 7 a.m., my office door swung open without a knock. Grant walked in still wearing last night's rage-like cologne, gripping a thick manila envelope like it was a weapon he'd been sharpening all night. You really don't get it, do you? He said, dropping the envelope onto my desk so hard my coffee jumped in its cup. Divorce papers. Standard. Enforces every clause of that prenup you were so eager to sign. He leaned over the desk, close enough that I could smell the wine still on him. You walk away with nothing, Naomi. He straightened up, chest puffed, certain he'd already won. 3 days, he said. Pack your cheap clothes and get out before the weekend. If you're still here Monday, I'll have security drag you to the curb. He walked out without waiting for a response, the door bouncing off the wall behind him. He had no idea he'd just handed me the final piece I needed. He wanted me gone in 3 days. I only needed 2 hours. By noon, the house was already shaking with Bess. Chloe had thrown a party to celebrate my exit, her friends spilling drinks across the leather sofas. Muddy shoes tracked over the glass coffee tables. Liquor from Grant's locked cellar poured carelessly into red plastic cups. She threw her designer bag at my chest on her way past and told me to clean the mess since I was getting kicked out anyway. I didn't flinch. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. Timestamps, damage. Minors drinking in plain view, one of them not even 18 yet. A boy from Chloe's school named Tyler, who I'd later learn was still a junior. Chloe had no idea she was handing me the exact leverage I needed to move faster than Grant could have ever imagined. That's when Brad and Maya pushed through the crowd toward me. Brad, my sister's husband, leaned against the kitchen counter, grinning like he'd already rehearsed this. Grant told me the good news. Divorce, 3 days. I already found you a cheap apartment on the south side. Roaches included, but hey, it's on the bus line. Maya sighed and rested a hand on my shoulder, a hand I shrugged off immediately. Just apologize to him, Naomi. Get on your knees if you have to. It's better than being homeless. I looked at both of them. Two people who had spent years riding riding on the edges of Grant's money, showing up at his golf tournaments, calling themselves family at every holiday dinner he hosted. "Keep that landlord's number," I told Brad. "You're going to need it a lot sooner than I will." He laughed. He was certain I was bluffing. I smiled at Chloe and said one quiet sentence that made her face go pale. 4 words she would repeat back to her father within the hour, twisted and hysterical. And by the time I walked back upstairs to change out of that plain navy dress, the wheels I'd set in motion the night before were already rolling toward his front door, faster than anyone in that house could possibly stop. I hadn't always been the woman who could sit in a room and say 4 quiet words and watch someone's face drain of color. 6 years ago, I was 31, freshly divorced from a man who'd cheated with a coworker and left me with $18,000 in credit card debt and a townhouse in Raleigh I couldn't afford alone. I remember standing in that kitchen doing math on a napkin, deciding I would never again be a woman who didn't understand her own finances down to the dollar. I remember too calling my mother that same week, hoping for comfort, and hearing her tell me that maybe if I'd been more present in the marriage, things might have turned out differently. A comment that taught me early on exactly how much backbone I could expect from Valerie when a man's feelings were on the line versus mine. I took a job at a boutique investment firm on Fayetteville Street, making $51,000 a year, learned everything I could about distressed debt and structured credit, and by the time I was 35, I had left to start my own fund with 2 partners and $11 million in committed capital from a handful of people who trusted my read on risk more than my resume. I remember the exact morning I decided I would never again let a man manage the story of my own competence. It was a Tuesday in late September, 6 years before I met Grant, and I was sitting in the parking lot of a branch bank on 6 Forks Road, trying to figure out how to open an account my ex-husband couldn't see, because even after the divorce papers were signed, he still had a habit of calling to ask what I'd done with the money, as though I were a teenager who needed supervision. His name was Curtis. We'd been married 9 years. He worked in pharmaceutical sales and made good money and spent better than he made it. And somewhere in the last 2 years of that marriage, I'd stopped correcting him when he told dinner guests I did some bookkeeping, instead of explaining that I managed a 7-figure book of client assets at the firm where I worked. It felt easier at the time to let him have the smaller version of me. I understand now that it wasn't easier. It was just quieter, and I had confused the two. By the time I met Grant, I was 41. The fund had grown past $300 million. I kept my public profile almost non-existent on purpose, a habit born less out of humility and more out of a hard lesson from my first marriage, where every dollar I earned had somehow become a weapon my ex-husband used against me, either to guilt me for working too much or to justify spending it before I could save it. I decided the next man I let into my life would have to love the version of me that looked on paper like nothing special. I met Grant Whitfield at a charity gala for the Mecklenburg County Literacy Council in October, 3 years ago now, seated 2 tables over, laughing at something his business partner said with his head thrown back in a way that seemed, at the time, unguarded and easy. He was 50, a commercial real estate developer with a portfolio of strip malls and mid-rise office buildings across the Carolinas, recently divorced from Chloe's mother, a woman named Priscilla, who had, according to Grant, taken him for everything, in a settlement that left him, in his own dramatic telling, practically destitute. I would later learn that practically destitute meant he still owned a 6-bedroom house on Larkspur Lane, a boat, and a wine cellar worth more than my first car. Our second date was at a small Italian place on East Boulevard, the kind of restaurant where the owner remembers your name after one visit, and Grant spent most of the evening talking about a strip mall renovation in Rock Hill that had gone over budget by nearly $200,000. I remember being struck even then by how easily he talked about large sums of money as though they were weather, something that simply happened to him rather than something he managed. I found it charming at the time, a kind of confidence I mistook for competence. It would take me almost 3 years to understand the difference. He asked me, halfway through the tiramisu, what I did for fun outside of work, and when I told him I liked to run in the mornings before the office opened, he smiled and said, "A finance girl who runs. I like that. Low maintenance." I let the comment go. I let a lot of comments go in those early months, filing them away the way I file everything, quietly, without confrontation, because the version of me that had survived Curtis had learned that confrontation early in a relationship tended to end the relationship, and I liked the way Grant made me feel less alone on a Tuesday night. He courted me carefully, flowers on a Tuesday for no reason, handwritten notes tucked into my coat pocket. He asked good questions and seemed to actually listen to the answers, which, after my first marriage, felt like being handed water after a long walk through the desert. He remembered that I preferred red wine to white, remembered the name of the deli near my office, small, unremarkable details that felt, at the time, like proof of genuine attention, rather than the practiced habits of a man who had simply gotten good at courtship through repetition. I told him I worked in finance, kept my answers vague the way I kept them vague with everyone, and he never pushed. Looking back, I understand now that he never pushed because he simply assumed the ceiling on what I could be. A woman who worked in an office, who wore modest jewelry, who drove herself to dinner in an old Honda Accord, was, in his mind, already fully accounted for. There was no hidden depth to investigate because he had already decided there wasn't one. Chloe was 17 when we met, a junior at a private school in South Charlotte, and from the very first dinner, I understood exactly what I was walking into. She'd been raised, since her parents' divorce when she was 14, almost entirely by nannies, tutors, and a father who compensated for his absence with cash. Grant missed her middle school graduation for a deal closing in Savannah and sent, in his own words, something better than a stupid ceremony, which turned out to be a $4,000 shopping trip with her mother's credit card that he later reimbursed. He missed her 16th birthday for a golf trip and sent the bracelet. He missed her senior night for a dinner with investors and sent a car service to take her and 6 friends to a steakhouse downtown, $1,100 on the company card. Every absence became a transaction. Every transaction became, in Chloe's mind, evidence that money was the only love language her father spoke fluently, and so it became the only one she spoke back to him in as well, sharp and demanding and never quite satisfied. I met her for the first time at a spring formal she was attending, a photo-taking event in the front hallway of the house that Grant had insisted on hosting before he and I had even had a real conversation about what I would be to her, stepmother or girlfriend, or simply the woman occupying her father's Saturday nights. Chloe wore a green dress and barely glanced at me, addressing all of her questions about the evening directly to her father, as though I were furniture positioned slightly to his left. When I complimented her corsage, she said, without looking over, "It's from Belk. Dad's assistant picked it up." I understood, even in that small exchange, that I was being told something important. Even the small kindnesses in that house came pre-delegated, purchased, and handed off, and I was being warned, gently but unmistakably, that I would never be anything more than another item on somebody's errand list. I tried, in those early months, to find a way in with her that didn't run through Grant. I asked her about school. I asked about her friends. I offered, once, to help her study for an economics exam, a subject I actually knew something about, and she looked at me the way you'd look at someone offering to help carry a bag you never asked them to touch. "I have a tutor," she said, "a real one." I didn't offer again. I told myself at the time that 17 was a hard age, that she'd lost her parents' marriage before she'd even finished losing her childhood, that patience was the only reasonable response to a girl still grieving something she hadn't chosen. I still believe that was true. What I didn't understand yet was that patience without any reciprocal effort from the other side isn't a virtue. It's just a slower kind of erosion. The early warning sign came 8 months before the wedding, at a dinner Grant hosted to introduce me to his business partners. Chloe arrived 40 minutes late, walked straight past me without a greeting, and told her father in front of 6 guests that she needed $900 for a dress, or I'm not going to Aunt Reggie's thing this weekend. Grant reached for his wallet at the table, mid-conversation, without so much as a pause, and handed her the cash while apologizing to his guests for the interruption, as though it were the weather. I remember watching that exchange and feeling something cold settle in my stomach, a recognition I didn't yet have language for. Grant didn't even pause his conversation with the man beside him, a developer named Aaron he was courting for a joint venture, as he handed over the cash, as though writing a check to his own daughter mid-sentence were simply part of the evening's rhythm, no more remarkable than passing the bread. I told myself it was grief, a motherless-feeling girl acting out, even though her mother was very much alive, just 30 minutes away in a house Grant had bought her as part of the settlement, a detail that should have told me something on its own about how loosely Grant applied words like motherless when they served the story he wanted to tell about his daughter's behavior. I told myself Grant would eventually draw a line. I was wrong on both counts, though it would take another 2 years for the second mistake to fully reveal itself. The proposal itself came 6 months after that dinner, on a weekend trip to Charleston that Grant had planned with uncharacteristic precision, a horse-drawn carriage, a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a dinner reservation at a restaurant on the water, where he got down on one knee in front of strangers who applauded politely and went back to their own conversations. I said yes. I meant it. I remember the specific coolness of the harbor air that night, the smell of fluff mud and salt, the way Grant's hands shook slightly when he opened the ring box, a nervousness that felt, at the time, like proof of how much this mattered to him. I remember standing on that dock afterward, looking out at the harbor, thinking that whatever cracks I'd noticed in the foundation of his relationship with Chloe were separate from the foundation of what he and I were building together, that I could love him and still hold a boundary with her, that those were 2 different projects entirely. I understand now how naive that distinction was. A man's relationship with his child isn't a separate wing of the house. It's load-bearing. Everything else gets built on top of it, whether you notice the weight or not. The wedding planning brought its own warning signs, small enough to explain away individually, damning only in retrospect when laid end to end. Chloe refused to try on bridesmaid dresses 3 separate times, citing scheduling conflicts that always seemed to evaporate the moment Grant offered to buy her something unrelated instead. My mother, when I asked her to help me find a dress, spent most of the appointment texting Grant updates about which one I'd picked, something I only discovered because he mentioned it approvingly at dinner that night, congratulating himself on staying in the loop. I laughed it off at the time, told myself it was just Valerie being Valerie, eager to please, uncomfortable with conflict the way she'd always been uncomfortable with conflict, going back to my own childhood when she'd let my father speak over her at every dinner table decision for 31 years of marriage before he passed. I understand now that I married into a family that mirrored the one I'd grown up in far more closely than I wanted to admit at the time, a house where the loudest man's comfort came first, and everyone else learned to arrange themselves quietly around that fact. The wedding itself was small, 42 guests at a vineyard backyard outside Asheville in late October, and if I'm honest, it was a beautiful day. Grant cried during his vows, real tears, and for years afterward, I would return to the memory of that particular moment whenever I needed proof that the man I'd married had, at some point, genuinely meant to love me well. Chloe gave a toast at the reception that managed to mention her mother twice and me not at all, a small enough omission that most of the room probably didn't notice, but I noticed, seated at the head table in a dress I'd chosen without my mother's opinion weighing on it, smiling for a room full of people who mostly knew Grant far better than they knew me. Maya found me in the bathroom an hour later, reapplying lipstick I didn't need to reapply, and asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine. She didn't push. That was the pattern that would define the next 6 months of my family's involvement in my life. A soft, well-meaning question, followed immediately by relief when I said the easy thing instead of the true thing. Maya and I had been close once, genuinely close, sharing an apartment for 2 years after college before she married Brad, and I married my first mistake of a husband. I've thought a lot since the divorce about when exactly that closeness started to erode, and I don't think there's a single moment I can point to. I think it was simply easier for Maya to treat my discomfort as an overreaction than to risk her own comfortable place at Grant's table, the golf invitations for Brad, the holiday gatherings at a house nicer than anything either of them could afford on their own. I don't say that to condemn her entirely. I understand the pull of proximity to money, understand it better than most people, having spent a career studying exactly how it distorts judgment in otherwise reasonable people. I just wish, standing in that bathroom in my wedding dress, she had chosen me instead of the path of least resistance. I think some part of her wishes that too now, though we haven't said so directly to each other yet. We honeymooned in Portugal for 9 days, and it was, without exaggeration, the best week of the entire relationship. Away from Chloe, away from the house, away from whatever performance Grant felt obligated to give his daughter and his old friends, he was funny and attentive and genuinely curious about my work in a way he'd never quite managed to be at home. I remember thinking, on a terrace in Porto with a glass of Vinho Verde, that maybe the version of him I'd fallen for at the Literacy Gala hadn't been a performance after all, that maybe it just required distance from Charlotte to surface properly. We flew home on a Sunday. By Tuesday, Chloe had moved back into what she called her side of the house for the summer, and the Grant who had held my hand across a table in Porto had already started disappearing back into the version of himself that needed his daughter's approval more than he needed my peace of mind. Within that first week home, I brought it up gently, the way I brought most things up with Grant back then, careful and roundabout, more question than statement. I asked whether he thought it might help Chloe to have a clearer sense of what things cost, maybe even a small allowance structure instead of open-ended cash on demand. He nodded along while I spoke, told me it was a good thought, and then, the following week, bought her a pair of $800 boots for no occasion at all, as if to prove to both of us that my suggestion had been noted and dismissed in the same motion. I stopped offering suggestions about Chloe's upbringing after that. I understood even then that I hadn't actually been invited to have an opinion. I had only been invited to witness. Looking back at that first year now, from the other side of everything, I can see the shape of the trap more clearly than I could while I was standing inside it. Every small dismissal was survivable on its own. That was the design of it, whether Grant understood it as a design or simply stumbled into the pattern out of habit. A wife who leaves over one bad dinner looks unreasonable. A wife who leaves after 18 months of small deniable cruelties looks, to everyone watching from outside the marriage, like she must have been building toward something all along. I wasn't building toward anything, not at first. I was simply trying to survive each individual evening with my dignity mostly intact. One dinner, one dismissed suggestion, one apologized for interruption at a time, never quite adding up the total until the night the total came due at my own dinner table. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. The escalation didn't happen all at once. It happened the way water finds its way into a foundation, slow and patient, until one day the whole structure is compromised, and nobody can say exactly when it started. The first real crack came 3 weeks into the marriage. I'd moved into the house on Larkspur Lane with 2 suitcases and a modest collection of furniture I chose to leave in storage, rather than clutter a home that already had everything. I offered to contribute to the mortgage, told Grant I was happy to split the utilities and groceries evenly, and he waved me off with the kind of generous magnanimity that, in hindsight, was really about control. "You don't worry about that," he'd said, kissing my forehead. "This is my responsibility. You just focus on making this place feel like a home." I didn't understand yet that in his mind, that sentence was a leash, not a gift. I want to be fair here, because fairness is something I've tried to hold on to even after everything, and there were good weeks in that first stretch of the marriage. Grant took me to dinner every Friday without fail for the first 3 months, a standing reservation at a place downtown that made a scallop dish he knew I loved. He remembered small things, the name of my college roommate, the fact that I hated cilantro, the anniversary of my father's death, and would text me something kind on that date every year without my ever having to remind him. I bring this up not to excuse what came later, but because I think it matters, in telling a story like this one, to admit that the man wasn't a cartoon villain from the very first handshake. He was a man capable of real tenderness who had also built over decades an entire architecture culture of avoidance around his daughter, and the tenderness and the avoidance lived in him at the same time, taking turns depending on which one Chloe's mood that week required of him. Chloe treated the arrangement as an insult from the beginning. She started referring to me, within earshot, as Dad's roommate. When I reorganized the pantry, she reorganized it back within the hour and told her father I was trying to erase Mom. When I hung 2 of my own paintings in the hallway, small watercolors I'd bought from an artist in Asheville, they came down within a week, replaced with family photos that conspicuously excluded me. And Grant told me when I asked that Chloe was still adjusting and I should give her space. I gave her space. I gave her 11 months of space, actually, biting my tongue at 100 small cruelties, waiting for the adjustment period to end. The second escalation came at Thanksgiving, 5 months into the marriage. I had spent 2 days preparing the meal, a turkey brined the way my grandmother taught me, sides made from scratch, because I wanted foolishly to build some kind of bridge. Chloe arrived with 3 friends nobody had been told to expect, ate exactly 4 bites, and announced at the table that she was going to order Thai food because some of us actually eat food that isn't dry. Grant laughed, actually laughed, the same easy laugh I'd fallen for at that literacy gala, except now it was aimed at my humiliation instead of a stranger's joke. When I asked him privately, later that night, whether he thought that had been appropriate, he told me I was too sensitive for someone who claims to be so put together, and that maybe I needed to work on not taking everything so personally. I remember standing in our bathroom afterward, brushing my teeth, watching my own face in the mirror, and thinking very clearly, this is not going to get better on its own. Between the Thanksgiving incident and what came next, there was a smaller moment that I almost left out of this story entirely, because on its own, it seems too minor to matter. In January, my mother and sister came for a Sunday brunch I'd spent all morning preparing, hoping again, foolishly, that seeing me host well might soften something between us. Chloe showed up unannounced with 2 friends, helped herself to the mimosas I'd set out for my mother's visit, and when I gently mentioned that the pitcher was for our guests, she looked at Valerie and said, loud enough for the whole room, "Is she always this uptight or is it just around family?" My mother laughed, actually laughed, a small, nervous, appeasing laugh, the same laugh she'd give at every family function for the rest of that year whenever Chloe said something cutting, because Valerie had decided, somewhere in those first months, that staying on Grant and Chloe's good side mattered more than staying on mine. I didn't say anything that day either. I was still, at that point, keeping a running ledger of small humiliations I told myself I was too mature to react to. I understand now that maturity and self-erasure had started, somewhere in that house, to look identical to me. The third escalation involved money directly, which was, I now understand, always the real terrain of this family's warfare. In February, 6 weeks before the dinner that finally broke everything open, Grant came to me with a request. A project he was developing, a mixed-use retail space in Fort Mill, had run into a financing gap. $60,000, he said, just a bridge until the next draw came through from his lender. He asked if I had any savings I could contribute, framing it as a partnership, as something husbands and wives did for each other. I told him I could put together $15,000, which was in truth a fraction of what I actually had access to, but which represented, to the version of myself he believed he'd married, nearly everything. He took the $15,000 without a second thought, and 2 weeks later bought Chloe a used BMW for her 21st birthday, $18,000 cash from a dealership in Pineville. When I gently pointed out the timeline, he told me I was keeping score in a marriage, which he called toxic, and that if I wanted to be treated like a partner, I should stop acting like an accountant. I remember exactly where we were standing when he said it, in the garage next to the space where the BMW would sit for exactly 9 days before Chloe wrecked the front bumper, backing out of a parking spot at her school, and Grant paid $2,200 to have it fixed without a single question asked. I asked him, standing in that garage, whether he understood how it looked. A wife handing over $15,000 for a business emergency while a birthday gift materialized within weeks. He told me I was making him feel like a bad father for trying to make up for lost time with his daughter, and somehow, by the end of that conversation, I was the one apologizing, standing in a cold garage at 10 at night, promising him I hadn't meant it the way it sounded. I remember driving to work the next morning, replaying that apology in my head, trying to understand exactly when I had agreed to be the one who kept smoothing things over. That was the fourth escalation, in a way, the reframing. Every time I pointed at a pattern, he handed the pattern back to me, repainted as a character flaw of mine. I wasn't observant. I was petty. I wasn't setting a boundary. I was cold. I started to understand, somewhere around March, that Grant Whitfield had built an entire emotional economy around never being wrong, and that Chloe had learned the exact same trick from him, just with less polish and more volume. There was a specific evening, a Sunday, when I tried a different approach. I wrote down, calmly in a shared notebook I bought specifically for the purpose, 3 examples of moments where I'd felt dismissed, dates and details included, hoping the written record might land differently than another late-night conversation. Grant read the notebook at the kitchen table, in silence, for almost 10 minutes. When he finally looked up, he told me it was a little much, that most husbands would find a wife keeping a written log of grievances controlling, and that he hoped I wasn't planning on using it against him someday. I closed the notebook. I didn't write in it again, but I didn't throw it away either. It sat in the bottom drawer of my office desk for the rest of the marriage. 3 pages of dates and details that would later later prove far more useful to Renata than Grant could have possibly imagined when he told me it was a little much. The fifth escalation, the one that should have ended things but didn't, came 4 weeks before the dinner. I discovered, entirely by accident, going through some files to help Grant locate a document for his accountant, that he had taken out a second mortgage on the Larkspur Lane house 8 months before we'd even met, one Chloe's mother had apparently never known about either, and that he was significantly further behind on payments than the modest financial picture he'd painted for me. I didn't say anything right away. I filed the information the way I file everything, quietly, patiently, the same instinct that had built a $400 million fund out of $11 million and a napkin full of math. I started paying closer attention. That's when I noticed the loan servicer's name on the paperwork, a small firm I recognized from an entirely different context. That's when the idea, the one that would end with me sitting at my desk at 3 in the morning confirming signatures, first started to take shape. I want to be honest about this part, because honesty is the only thing I have left to offer in telling this story. I didn't buy that mortgage out of some grand strategic vision from the very beginning. I bought it because I was tired, and because I finally had proof in black and white that the man who called me a guest in his own house had been quietly drowning in debt the entire time he condescended to me about my modest little $70,000 salary. Douglas walked me through the file line by line over the phone, patient in the way careful men often are with numbers, reading me the modification date, the missed payment history, the notice of default filed 8 weeks before our wedding invitations had even gone out to the printer. I remember sitting perfectly still at my desk, the coffee gone cold beside me, feeling less like a wronged wife and more like an analyst who had just found the load-bearing flaw in a structure everyone else had assumed was sound. That, I think, is the strangest part of finding out you've been lied to by someone you married. The grief and the competence arrive at exactly the same moment, and you don't get to choose which one goes first. The final escalation, the one that led directly to the dinner table, happened 3 days before Chloe called me the help. Grant sat me down and told me he wanted me to sign over my portion of a joint checking account we'd opened together, one I'd funded almost entirely, to help cover Chloe's spring semester tuition at the private university she attended in South Carolina, a school costing $52,000 a year that Grant could no longer comfortably afford, and refused to admit he couldn't afford. I told him I needed to think about it. He told me that thinking about it, given everything he'd given me, given the home and the china and the last name, was a strange way to show gratitude. "I gave you a life, Naomi," he said, standing in the doorway of my office with his arms crossed. "A home, a name, a family, whether you think they've welcomed you or not. And you can't hand over a checking account for my daughter's education?" I told him it wasn't about the money, that it had never been about the money, that it was about being asked, again, to prove my loyalty through a wire transfer instead of being trusted the way a partner should be trusted. He told me I sounded exactly like his ex-wife right before she tried to take him for everything. I didn't respond to that. There was nothing left to say to a man who had already decided which story he was living in, regardless of what I actually said inside of it. That word, gratitude, sat in my chest for 3 days like a stone. It was still sitting there on the night of the lamb, the rosemary, his mother's china, and a 20-year-old telling me I looked like the help. The revelation, when it finally came, arrived less than an hour after Grant slammed that manila envelope onto my desk. I called Renata at 7:15 to confirm the mortgage acquisition documents were fully executed and recorded with the county, which they were, and had been for 11 weeks. But it was the second call, the one to my forensic accountant, a careful, unglamorous man named Douglas Pruitt, who had audited Ashcombe Holdings' new asset for due diligence purposes that changed the entire shape of the story. Douglas had been quietly reviewing the servicing file since the acquisition closed, standard procedure whenever the fund takes on distressed residential debt, and he'd found something in the loan history that made him call me back within the hour, instead of waiting for our scheduled Friday check-in. The second mortgage on Larkspur Lane, the one I'd discovered by accident in March, hadn't been taken out to cover a business shortfall the way Grant implied when I confronted him. It had been taken out 4 months before that, in the immediate aftermath of his divorce from Priscilla, to pay a settlement obligation he'd hidden from everyone, including, it seemed, Chloe. Buried in the servicing notes was a court filing, a modification agreement tied to the divorce decree, that revealed Priscilla had actually been awarded partial ownership interest in the Larkspur Lane property itself, a state Grant had never disclosed to her, structured through a complicated refinance meant to buy her out quietly over 5 years. He had missed 3 of those buyout payments. Priscilla's attorney had already filed a formal notice of default against him 2 months before our wedding. Grant had married me, waived my rights through that prenup, and never once mentioned that his own ex-wife held a legal claim on the very house he'd just threatened to throw me out of. The man who screamed that it was his house, his money, his rules, didn't fully own the house at all. He'd been so certain of his own kingdom that he never checked whether the walls were still his. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something shift that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with clarity. This wasn't just a man who'd let his daughter humiliate his wife at dinner. This was a man who had spent years building a fortress out of debt he refused to look at directly, propping the whole structure up with other people's money and other people's silence, mine most recently, Priscilla's before that. Chloe's cruelty, I understood now, wasn't just spoiled entitlement. It was a child mirroring a father who had taught her, through years of guilty cash and absent birthdays, that love and money were the same currency, and that anyone without enough of either didn't deserve a seat at the table. I felt for one unguarded moment something close to sadness for her. It didn't last long. Sadness is a luxury I couldn't afford that morning. Not with a 3-day countdown ticking over my head and a folder full of leverage sitting on my desk. I called Renata back and told her to file the notice. The confrontation happened that evening, in the study, with Brad and Maya still lingering in the kitchen because Grant had asked them to stay, apparently wanting an audience for what he assumed would be my tearful surrender. Chloe stood in the doorway, arms crossed. Her earlier bravado from the party dulled into something more watchful now that word had reached her about the 4 quiet words I'd said before I went upstairs to change. Grant sat behind his desk like a man behind a bench, gesturing for me to sit across from him as though I were a tenant come to beg for an extension. "I hope you've come to your senses," he said. "Renata Cole called my attorney an hour ago talking about liens and holding companies. I don't know what stunt you're pulling, Naomi, but it ends tonight." "It's not a stunt," I said. I stayed standing. "3 months ago, my firm purchased your defaulted first mortgage on this house. Every rent check you've been sending to a lender in Delaware has been coming directly to me." Brad let out a low whistle from the doorway. Maya reached for the back of a chair like she needed something to hold on to. Grant's mouth opened and closed once before any words came out. The same expression, I imagine, that Chloe's friends had worn earlier that day when I photographed the wine bottles from his locked cellar sitting empty on his glass tables. "You've been paying me $2,200 a month," I said, "to live in a house I already own." The room went very quiet. Brad, leaning in the doorway, actually laughed, a short, disbelieving bark, before he saw Grant's face and stopped. "That's not possible," Grant said, but his voice had lost its floor. "It's recorded with the county," I said. "Renata can send you the file number tonight if you'd like to verify it yourself." I let that sit for a second before I continued, because the next part was the part that mattered most. "But that's not actually why I'm here. I'm here because of the second mortgage, the one you took out to cover Priscilla's settlement, the one you've missed 3 payments on, the one where she holds partial ownership of this house that you've never disclosed to Chloe, or to me, or apparently to your own accountant." Chloe's arms uncrossed. She looked at her father, really looked at him, for what I suspect was the first time in a long while without a demand attached to the look. "What is she talking about, Dad?" Her voice had none of its usual performance in it. For a moment, she looked exactly like the girl in the green dress from that spring formal, young and unsteady, and waiting for an adult in the room to make things make sense again. Grant's face did something I had never seen it do in 3 years of knowing him. It emptied. "Chloe, honey, that's not—" "She's twisting things. She doesn't understand the financing." "Explain it then," Chloe said, and her voice cracked in a way that startled me, because I had genuinely, up to that moment, believed her incapable of anything but performance. "Explain why Mom owns part of this house. Explain why you told me last year we might have to sell it because of her." She pointed at me. Her father didn't have an explanation ready, because he had never once expected to need one. He had built his entire authority in that house on the assumption that nobody in it would ever check his math. I looked at him, and I said the thing I had come downstairs to say, the thing I'd been building toward, not just since that morning, but since the night of the lamb and the rosemary and the china that wasn't going to be mine to set again. "You told me I had no say in your house," I said. "You were right. I don't, because as of 11 weeks ago, it isn't your house. It's mine. And you have 3 days to pack your cheap wine and get out, or I'll have my attorney do it for you." Nobody in that room defended him. Not Brad, who had gone pale and quiet against the doorframe, doing rapid math about how many golf trips he'd taken on Grant's card. Not Maya, who wouldn't meet my eyes, but also, for the first time all evening, wouldn't meet Grant's either. Not Chloe, who had walked out of the study without another word, her footsteps heavy on the stairs, a girl learning in real time that the kingdom she'd been raised inside had never actually belonged to the king. The days that followed unfolded faster than any of us were prepared for. Grant's attorney called Renata the next morning demanding to see the recorded deed, and within an hour was forced to acknowledge, with visible reluctance, that everything I'd said was accurate down to the recording number. Grant tried, briefly, to fight it, hiring a second attorney to argue that the acquisition of his mortgage by his own wife's firm constituted some kind of conflict or bad faith, a claim Renata dismantled inside of a single letter by pointing out that Ashcombe Holdings had purchased the note from a third-party seller in an arm's-length transaction 11 weeks before Grant had ever threatened me with divorce papers, well before any conflict could reasonably be alleged. There was nothing improper about it. There was only the fact that I had known something he didn't, for longer than he could stand to think about. Priscilla, Chloe's mother, reached out to me directly 9 days after the confrontation, which surprised me more than almost anything else that happened that month. She'd heard about the mortgage from Chloe, who had apparently called her in tears the same night, and she wanted, she said, to understand exactly how much of the house's equity had actually been protected under her settlement, because Grant's missed payments meant her own buyout was now at risk too. We met for coffee in a shop off Providence Road, 2 women who by all rights should have hated each other on principle, comparing notes on a man who had, it turned out, lied to both of us in remarkably similar ways, just at different points in his life. She told me things about their marriage that reframed Chloe for me entirely, how Grant had used money as an apology for years before the divorce too, how Priscilla herself had begged him for family therapy for Chloe when she was 12 and he'd refused, calling it an unnecessary expense the same year he bought a boat, how Chloe had actually cried once, at 11 years old, asking her mother why Dad daddy only came to the games he could brag about to his friends. Priscilla told me this last part quietly, stirring her coffee without drinking it, and I understood that she'd carried that memory alone for almost a decade, never quite sure who else in her life would understand its weight. I left that conversation with less anger toward Chloe than I'd walked in with, and considerably more toward the man who had shaped her. My mother's reaction to the divorce disappointed me in a way I'm still working through, honestly, even now. Valerie called 2 days after the confrontation, not to ask how I was holding up, but to ask whether I thought I'd been too harsh with Grant, whether there was still a way to smooth things over before the whole family had to pick sides at holidays. I told her as gently as I could manage that I hadn't asked anyone to pick a side the night Chloe called me the help, and that nobody at that table had picked mine either. She went quiet for a long moment, and then she said something I didn't expect. She said she was sorry. Not a full accounting of the last 18 months. Not an apology for every mouthed sorry aimed at Grant instead of at me, but a real small, halting apology that I chose to accept because I understood by then that Valerie had spent 31 years married to a man who taught her that peace was worth more than honesty. And unlearning that lesson at 63 isn't something that happens over one phone call. We're rebuilding something now, slowly. It isn't what I wanted from her at that dinner table. It's what's actually available, and I've learned to tell the difference between those two things. Brad and Maya's allegiance, which I'd expected to remain firmly with Grant, given how thoroughly they'd sided against me at the party, fractured within 2 weeks, not out of any loyalty to me, but out of the discovery that Grant had, for the past year, been quietly borrowing money from Brad as well. $11,000 across 4 separate, just until the deal closes, loans that had never been repaid. Brad showed up at my office unannounced, sheepish in a way I'd never seen from him, asking whether I had any advice on how to actually get his money back from a man now facing a foreclosure timeline of his own making. I told him the same thing I'd told him the day of the party. He should have kept that landlord's number. He didn't find it as funny this time. Grant's desperation peaked in the second week, when he attempted, through his attorney, to argue that the prenup I'd signed should also bind any assets acquired by entities connected to me during the marriage, an aggressive and, according to Renata, laughably unenforceable stretch that would have required proving Ashcombe Holdings was somehow a marital asset, rather than a fund vehicle that predated our relationship by 9 years. When that failed, he tried calling me directly. Late one night, his voice gone soft and pleading in a register I hadn't heard since the literacy gala. He told me he still loved me. He told me none of this had to happen this way. He told me if I just gave him 90 days, he could refinance, catch up on Priscilla's buyout, keep the house, keep us, keep everything. I listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and when he finished, I told him gently that I believed he loved something. I just didn't think it was me. I think he loved having a wife who didn't ask questions. That version of me had died at a dinner table over roasted lamb, and I wasn't interested in resurrecting her for his convenience. There was a night, about 3 weeks into the process, when I sat alone in the house on Larkspur Lane, technically mine now in every legal sense, and let myself grieve the thing I'd actually wanted when I married him. I hadn't wanted a kingdom. I'd wanted a partner who saw me clearly, flaws and modest car and unglamorous savings habits included, and loved what he saw rather than what he assumed. I mourned that version of the marriage quietly, alone, in a kitchen I'd once tried so hard to make feel like a home for a family that had never once tried to make room for me in return. Grief, I've learned, doesn't require the other person to have deserved your love in order to be real. I had loved a version of Grant that mostly existed in my own hope for him. The man from the terrace in Porto. The man who cried during his vows. The man whose hands shook opening a ring box on a dock in Charleston. Losing that hope hurt more than losing the house ever could have, and the house, ironically, was the one thing I never actually lost. The legal process wrapped in a way that surprised even Renata with its speed, mostly because Grant, facing simultaneous pressure from my firm, from Priscilla's attorney, and from Brad quietly threatening a lawsuit of his own, ran out of runway to keep fighting on every front at once. The divorce was finalized 14 weeks after that dinner. Under the terms of the prenup he'd insisted on, I walked away with nothing from the marriage itself, exactly as he'd designed it. There was briefly a complication involving the wine cellar, of all things. When Grant's attorney tried to argue that a case of a rare Barolo I'd given him as an anniversary gift should count as a marital asset subject to division, a claim so small and so telling that Renata included it in her closing notes as, in her words, a portrait of the entire marriage in miniature. Priscilla's default judgment against him moved through family court on its own separate track, and by the time both matters resolved, Grant owed money to 3 different parties who had each, at different points, trusted him with something: a mortgage, a marriage, a loan between brothers-in-law, and each of us had learned in our own way and on our own timeline exactly what his trust was worth. Renata ended up using 3 pages from that old notebook after all, the one Grant had called a little much at our kitchen table, entering the dated entries into the record not as evidence of any legal claim, but as context for the judge handling a minor dispute over personal property Grant tried to drag out of spite. The watercolors, a set of pans, a coat he insisted I'd left behind on purpose to manufacture a reason to come back. Reading my own handwriting from over a year earlier, flat and careful, and trying so hard to sound reasonable, I felt an odd kind of tenderness for the woman who'd written it, still hoping, even then, that documentation might succeed where conversation had failed. It hadn't. Not with Grant. But it succeeded eventually, in a courtroom, in front of a judge who read 3 pages of dates and small cruelties and asked Grant's attorney, without much patience left in her voice, whether his client had any actual dispute with the facts as recorded. He never seemed to fully grasp, even at the end, that the prenup had never been the instrument that mattered. I'd never needed a claim on his assets. I already owned the asset that mattered most. Chloe moved in with her mother permanently that fall, transferring to a state school closer to home, a decision I understand cost considerably less than $52,000 a year, and that, according to Priscilla, has done more for her daughter's temperament than 4 years of private tuition ever did. I don't know if Chloe and I will ever speak again. I think honestly that we don't need to. I wasn't the villain in her story, but I understand now that I was never going to be anything but an obstacle in it either. Not because of anything I did, but because her father had built her entire worldview around scarcity dressed up as money, and scarcity always looks for someone to blame. I still live in the house on Larkspur Lane, though I've repainted the hallway and rehung the 2 watercolors from Asheville, and I sleep now in a room where nobody's ghost is watching to see if I belong there. I sold the boat. I kept the china, strangely, because it was never really his mother's fault what her son became, and good china shouldn't have to answer for the people who eat off it. I use it now on ordinary Tuesdays, for no occasion at all, which feels like its own quiet form of justice. That china that once sat under a humiliation is now just china again, holding whatever simple meal I've made for myself and no one else. Grant moved into a rental across town, and I hear, through the strange small world channel of Charlotte's business circles, that he started dating again, telling a new version of his story to a new woman who doesn't yet know to ask about the second mortgage. My work hasn't changed, though I run the fund now with a little more transparency about who I am outside the office, a decision that surprised colleagues who'd known me for a decade as the quiet, unassuming partner who never mentioned her personal life. I've started dating again, cautiously, and I've noticed myself doing something I never used to do, mentioning the fund on a first or second date instead of waiting, watching, deciding later whether someone had earned the fuller picture of who I am. I don't know yet if that's healed instinct or simple exhaustion with hiding. Maybe it doesn't matter which. Maybe the outcome is the same either way. A woman who no longer edits herself down to fit inside someone else's comfortable assumptions. People ask me sometimes, the few who know the whole story, whether I regret staying quiet for so long about who I really was and what I was really worth. I don't, not entirely. I think there's a version of wisdom that only comes from being underestimated long enough to watch, clearly and without interference, exactly who someone becomes when they believe no one is keeping score. Grant showed me his true kingdom the night he screamed that I had no say in his house. He just never imagined I'd already bought the deed while he was too busy laughing into his wine to notice the walls changing hands beneath him. I think about that dinner sometimes, the lamb going cold, the wine soaking into the lace, a 20-year-old telling me I looked like the help. I was never the help. I was simply the only person in that house who understood, the whole time, exactly what everything was worth. The lamb, the china, the marriage, the man. I understood all of it, long before he did. And I have made a kind of peace with the fact that understanding something clearly and wanting it to have been different are two feelings that can live in the same chest without canceling each other out.